Welcome, one and all, to RSR-102, a retrospective review of Dark Deity with your Professor Valentine. Class is now in session, and before you ask, yes, this will be on the exam. Dark Deity is a strategy RPG created by Charles Moore and Sword and Axe LLC, published in June of 2021 and originally funded via Kickstarter in September of the year prior. The game itself is a love letter to the Game Boy Advanced era of strategy and tactics games, very specifically Fire Emblem and Final Fantasy Tactics, and is made with a clear appreciation for the genre by its developers. Dark Deity wears its influence on its sleeve and with a manner of pride, and sees you as the player take control of a group of unique characters in turn-based grid-bound combat. The gameplay will feel familiar to anyone who has played a similar game before, with such things as unit combat speed, and thus the ability to double attack, being impacted by a weapon's weight, and a resistance to magic being independent of an ability to be protected from physical attacks. However, the game also presents a number of differences and arguable improvements. The most notable is the lack of individual weapons and weapon durability, where every unit comes pre-equipped with 4 different weapons based on their class, sorted into 4 primary categories: power, crit, hit, and balance, with each being able to be used an unlimited number of times and capable of being upgraded over the course of the game using upgrade tokens gained through the completion of levels or purchased with gold from the ever-present pre-battle shop. This leaves units' inventories free exclusively for healing items and the game's signature gimmick, the Eternal Aspects, both of which can be traded freely between deployed units who have not yet acted, irrespective of the unit's location on their turn. Aspects are items collected throughout the game that, when given to a unit, grant it a special ability of some description, ranging from bonus damage and counterattacks to temporarily shuffling their stats around while equipped, and certain class and aspect combinations can be quite powerful, although just as many feel practically useless outside of niche edge cases. Combat is, as would be expected for this sort of game. Units move next to their enemies, select the attack action, select what weapon to use, and then take a swing, suffering a counter-attack if the target survives and is in range to attack back. These combat interactions lack Fire Emblem's traditional weapon triangle system, and instead advantage is determined by a modifier to damage based on the enemy's armor type, which makes battles more about class matchups than specific weapons, which does help the game feeling dynamic without any particular type of weapon being dominant over any other, since the armor damage bonuses can swing as hard as plus or minus 30%. This isn't the only modifier to combat, however, as a unit's mastery stat as well as seemingly level play some part in all of the calculations, although exactly how is never really explained. The units the player receives are split into 6 main class trees, with 4 Tier 2 and 4 Tier 3 promotion options for each, and cannot be deviated from in any way. However, all characters are able to promote for free automatically upon reaching levels 10 and 30 respectively, into any Tier 2 or Tier 3 class within their tree. And with 5 characters received by the player in each class tree, you are free to mix and match various promotion combinations as you see fit, giving their characters a unique combination of skills and weapons and armor to approach the game's challenge with, even getting a free extra turn when they do so mid-battle. You can't promote outside of it. And without the risk of wasting resources on a unit that turns out to be less usable than their peers, aside from XP. Aside from their promotion options, the base classes also grant each unit a unique out-of-combat action that can be performed to help increase the tactical options a player has available to them. Fighters can push enemies and allies back a space to help create breathing room or get allies out of harm's way. Clerics can heal and don't require a specific resource beyond their turn to do so. Rangers can grant extra movement to allies, which is a very powerful ability. And mages can teleport other units from one side of them to the other. Rogues can disarm opponents to strip them of their weapons' stat bonuses, and adepts can lock enemies in place for a turn so they cannot move, limiting their options for attacks. These add a fresh feeling to picking which units to deploy to a battle, as these extra abilities can really sway the tide of things in your favour, or make a stage significantly more difficult if you lack a certain type. Although it should be noted that these abilities cannot be used against enemies marked as bosses, likely a tactic to counter cheese such as warp skipping. This does, however, bring up the biggest flaw to Dark Deity's gameplay, and that is balancing. Although the game is not difficult by any stretch of the word, the difficulty curve even on the game's easiest mortal mode is steep, especially if you're trying to use all of the units you have to some degree. Level difference plays some manner of a role in both the damage and 2-hit calculations the game uses. And whilst being a lower level and attacking or defeating an enemy grants an increased amount of experience to help close the level gap, these enemies also deal an increased amount of damage and are far more likely to hit. Although the game's stakes are relatively low, a unit's stat being reduced when defeated and removed from play, which stats specifically being based on the type of weapon that finished them off. This can cause, in conjunction with some unusual choices for enemy decision making, the game to turn into something akin to rocket tag, as enemy levels quickly shoot past what your own units have, outside of the fresh recruits that join at relatively high levels for their point in the game if you're trying to spread your XP evenly. So inching forward with tanks to aggro small groups at a time to then pummel from a distance with bows and magic becomes the norm. The run-on effects of these are fivefold. Firstly, any healing items the player receives are all functionally worthless. Outside of tanks, most units have a hard time surviving even 1 or 2 attacks from an enemy with the right matchup, so usually a unit isn't left standing if they're taking any sort of hit during an enemy phase, rendering such items effectively extra gold you need to spend time in the menu to receive. Secondly, when combined with the fact most abilities cannot be used against bosses, many of the out-of-combat skills a character has are either grossly over or undervalued. A rogue's disarm and an adept's chain ability matter little when the best targets they have for them are immune, but being able to teleport any unit longer distances becomes incredibly valuable. Thirdly, it means that certain classes and skill combinations are flat better than their alternatives in the tree, as abilities that increase defensive stats, grant the ability to heal from battle damage inflicted, or attack and move over greater ranges far outpace some of the more tactically interesting choices that you would otherwise have available. Fourth, it works counter to the game's intended design of quick levels, as player rewards are actively reduced as the turn count increases. Although on lower difficulties, this doesn't result in the player being starved for the gold needed to buy upgrade tokens for their unit's weapons, which is needed as the somewhat inflated stat lines of enemies in later chapters mean that underpowered or unupgraded weapons will have a very hard time dealing damage even on the strongest of attackers. On higher difficulties, where gold is reduced even further and the likelihood of sustaining a casualty requiring an expensive stat boosting item to restore its might is far higher, it could quickly become tedious. And it lastly railroads many of the decisions when it comes to using the limited resources such as weapon tokens at the player's disposal, as any weapon that is too heavy and thus increases the risk of a unit being double attacked is rarely worth the extra damage or accuracy that they provide outside of a few niche situations, and so many units ended up with their balanced weapons being the ones that I upgraded despite the additional options I had. I would imagine this would make the Deity difficult rather tedious to play through. Despite this, the game controls relatively fluidly through a menu-driven interface using the player's mouse over any other form of input. There is no controller support. The interface itself is clean and conveys its information well in large and easy-to-read text boxes and buttons, with very little being hidden behind submenus or additional clicks. It does, however, lack a level of polish that will be a running theme for the rest of this review, that can be found in games that inspire it, primarily regarding its documentation. Whilst the major stats have tooltips when hovered over, almost nothing else does, which leaves some elements of gameplay up to trial and error and guessing if you don't want to go and read the game's wiki. It's only a minor thing and far more forgivable in today's current internet age than it would have been in the early 2000s, but it is still a notable lack of polish that makes the game far less accessible to people who may not have played similar games in the past and know somewhat what to expect. The story is also reasonably bare bones, but it's serviceable, following a group of military academy students, our initial protagonists of Irving, Mabel, Garrick, and Alden, that are conscripted by their kingdom, Delia's, army before their graduation, and are then thrust into events larger than themselves as they become coincidentally embroiled in a plot revolving around the magical artifacts called the Eternal Aspects, that eventually leads them to trying to save the world from an evil sorcerer trying to attain godhood. It's very familiar ground to anyone who's played Final Fantasy Tactics or Fire Emblem, but it is executed solidly here. And much to its credit, none of Dark Deity's 28 chapters feel like filler. Everything has its place in the story, and things move forward at a solid pace right from the start, even when the stakes are as low as passing the end-of-year exams. The cast of characters presented is varied and colourful, and most play a significant role in the story at some point or another, with all being fleshed out rather heavily and with a surprising amount of nuance in their bond conversations, an analogue to the support systems present in Fire Emblem 7 onwards, unlocked by characters fighting close to one another, an analogue to the support system present in every Fire Emblem game following Fire Emblem 6, unlocked by characters fighting close to one another, when even characters that join the player under reasonably flimsy circumstances get proper development and motivations to stay with and interact with the group, and there are several standout moments in it that I greatly enjoyed. The biggest flaw the game's story has, aside from its perhaps cliché and tropey writing, is the amount of plot holes and undeveloped loose ends it does present. The game's story and characters hold together well enough for their own merit, but it does leave a lot of unexplained or only mentioned in passing. Whilst some of this can be excused as throwaway lines or plot hook fodder for DLCs or a sequel that I'm simply reading too much into, a number of major plot points are either never elaborated on or dropped as twists without any foreshadowing or warning. For example, it is mentioned multiple times that a set of countrywide aqueducts are being constructed at a frantic pace by Delia's king, who is later revealed to be working with the game's main antagonist, Sorcerer. And whilst I was somewhat expecting an almost Full Metal Alchemist like it was secretly part of the magic ritual to fulfill the evil endgame outcome, outside of the 2 times that it's mentioned in conversation and 1 chapter where it actively comes up, it's never touched on again and has absolutely no payoff. Similarly, a number of major twists are dropped in rapid succession in the game's final few chapters, and likely lack the punch that they were intended to have due to there being really no build-up for them. The main antagonist is only seen twice in cutscenes and once in a battle before the very final chapter, with their identity only really being known to the characters present just prior to this big reveal in the final space, which is a large contrast to how many such games spend their runtime slowly building up their main antagonists, or having them at the very least appear consistently throughout the story so that the opportunity for a final showdown does feel satisfying. Similarly, Irving, ostensibly the game's main character and lord character, quote-unquote, as would be common to games such as this, his character progression simply happens with very little explanation. With apparently zero prompting, everyone, including his at the time commanding officer, simply start deferring to him on matters of decision-making, without any instances of other decision-making processes faltering and, say, his quick thinking saving the day that would lead to him being listened to, or him being proven right against all odds when he's been vocal about some other issue that's being had. It just feels weird, and it continues through the rest of the story, especially when halfway through, a magical explosion created by the big bad and evil sorcerer, in his first and only battle appearance prior to the final chapter, stains his hair black and kills his brother, someone that is established Irving looks up to. Not only does he get over this death distressingly quickly within the space of a few cutscenes following the chapter, but what this spell was intended to achieve beyond immediate mass slaughter never went over, and it apparently causes Irving to become sensitive to the eternal aspects that the party is carrying, but what exactly that entails is never explored or expanded upon and has no impact on the gameplay. It simply feels like an afterthought. Much like my criticisms on gameplay, these aren't fatal flaws, but it does detract from the game's overall feeling of polish and in part makes the plot feel sloppy. I do wish more than a little more effort went into tightening up the story as much as the gameplay and the Bond conversations were. I do really like those. The Dark Deity is also entirely linear, with no side missions that could potentially be missed or characters that you can fail to recruit or otherwise permanently lose, leaving the only real replay value, outside of wanting to beat the game on the higher difficulties for the achievements, to be tinkering with class combinations to see what you have the most fun with and trying to see all the Bond conversations. As stated before, units need to be deployed together and fight or otherwise act nearby one another to unlock these Bond conversations. They otherwise have no impact on gameplay. They're locked to progression of of the game's main story, and this does mean that the Bond conversations allow the characters to grow and react to events that occur within the story. This does also combine with the deployment limit for any chapter maxing out at 14 out of the cast of 30, and the fact players are encouraged to beat chapters quickly means that it is quite difficult to see every Bond in a single playthrough of the game without serious pre-planning and foreknowledge, so you would need to replay the game multiple times just to see them all if you aren't going out of your way to see all of them at once. Given that a lot of plot and character development is hidden behind these Bonds, I would have preferred if they had simply unlocked as the story progressed, similar to the base conversations in Tellius Fire Emblem games, so that the world was as fleshed out as possible without needing to play the same levels over and over with different characters, especially when they can be well over an hour long, each playing the way the game encourages, as was discussed above. Where Dark Deity really shines is in its presentation of visuals. The game uses a combined visual novel style dialogue system, alongside pixel art for its maps and battle animations. The anime-style character portraits are large, clean, and well detailed without being overly gaudy or awash with senseless detail like some games do. And each, from pose to equipment, gives a good sense of the character they represent, even before any dialogue has been passed from the character. These portraits are also carried over into the game's battle animations, acting as a cut-in alongside short voice clips when the character scores critical hits, much like Fire Emblem Awakening and further. The pixel art used for the game's battle scenes and maps is where the most love is shown, however, with every class and character having a unique map sprite that is both eye-catching and visually distinct in any class, allowing for characters to be identified at a glance without needing to check a unit's status page every time. Similarly, the battle sprites are large, detailed, and well animated, with smooth motions and flashy swings by and large that make the battles a joy to witness. There are even some extra spectacular critical hit animations that show off some of the game's best work, especially in spells that have separate animations for when they're cast as a crit. Although the casters themselves do not, they have a single casting animation for all of their spells. My only real criticism is that there aren't that many enemy portraits. If you bother to check the status pages of many enemies, you quickly realize that there is a total of about 3, with some variations for undead enemies, generic portraits, and these designs often have little correlation to the enemy class that they are representing. Even Fire Emblem 6 had generic class icons which helped the designs feel more cohesive to the sprites on screen, which is all the more the shame because a number of NPCs and bosses have totally unique portraits and map sprites that are used for all of one level or a small handful of cutscenes, and these are some of the game's best designs, although I think some of this can be attributed to them being Kickstarter backer rewards and so couldn't be included too much more than they originally promised. This does lead me into my other minor criticism, which is that none of the characters feel particularly unique. Their designs, whilst well constructed and not bloated with frivolous detail, feel very much like the default runtime package in an RPG Maker engine. Distinct, but could be placed in a dozen different settings or games and still work just as well. Irving gets some plot-related details with his hair color change midway through the game, but Varric just looks like a fantasy king. Alden looks kind of like he's in a department store wizard costume, and so many of the designs are just a person in armor or evil wizard. Although perhaps that's for the best when I see at least one of the beta designs, I do enjoy a good character design like this as much as the next person, but it very much feels like it was designed for a very different sort of game, and the final design for Sloane is one I much prefer in this particular context, especially since I can't find any other cases of beta designs being like this, although I may just be unable to see them as I'm rather averse to the social media bird. Similarly, the music and SFX in the game are competent and well composed, fitting the standard fantasy world they are backdropping with appropriate tone. There just aren't that many of them. Maybe a little over half a dozen tracks in total across the entire game, with only 2 of those being battle music, so you'd best get used to hearing them. None of them are grating at the very least, but they do quickly become little more than background noise that you tune out. Again, much like the standard runtimes that are in RPG Maker. Nothing is bad, but it's not standout. The same, however, cannot be said for the game's voice acting. There isn't a lot of it, only a handful of snippets and the critical hit cut-ins for each character, but what is present is done to a very high standard. No 2 characters sound the same, the lines are crisp and well delivered, and whilst some of the critical hit quotes and level up dialogue feels a little out of context, they never necessarily feel out of character, which is an impressive feat. Time and effort was clearly put into hiring quality voice actors and making sure their lines were done as well as possible. I couldn't name anyone by ear, but I was thoroughly pleased with the results all around. There is one final bugbear to address, and that is bugs. Although I can't claim to have played the game on release despite owning it at release, much to my shame, and apparently the situation has far improved, the game does have a number of bugs. They're mostly benign, such as a sprite freaking out and flipping back and forth when they're shoved by a warrior, multi-hit attack animations displaying the wrong damage value numbers for each hit, although the correct amount of HP is still subtracted, due to rounding issues I'm imagining with how the UI is displayed, menu buttons not being clickable because they spawn off screen because of where you've placed the camera, or think there isn't a valid target for an ability or an attack when there is until you make the character move again. Unit sprites appearing offset to their actual locations by one tile is probably the worst offender that I've found of these sorts of bugs, as it can give you a false impression of where your units can be attacked from. There is, however, a singular game-breaking bug that I thankfully encountered only once, that causes the game to crash in Chapter 22, seemingly at random after a battle. I'm not entirely certain the cause, as it seems to occur at random, but it does make playing that particular chapter a frenzy to beat it even faster than normal to avoid losing all of your progress, which is somewhat annoying when it is one of the game's trickier chapters. This is the developer's first game, so rough edges are to be expected, but reports of this bug stretch back to nearly 5 years ago at the game's release on various forums, so it's not like it is a recent discovery, and I'm saddened that it hasn't been eradicated completely after all this time. But at the very least, forum posts seem to imply that the issue used to be a lot more common than it is now. I also didn't receive one of the game's eternal aspects, but I'm not sure if that's just because I didn't finish the level fast enough, so I'll only mention it in passing as a possible bug, since some dialogue post-battle did imply that the stone was never encountered, even if future dialogue seemed to imply the party had the aspect in their possession. Looking at its effects on the wiki, I don't think I would have used it anyway, as it's a gamble skill, but it is still irritating that I didn't have the option. Lastly, some of the game's mechanics do not seem to function as intended, specifically regarding targeting. The enemy's targeting logic seems to run on the amount of damage that could be dealt to a unit, rather than balancing that against the chance to actually make contact or cause the hit, or seeing if the enemy would die in the counterattack or not, although suicidal enemies in tactics games aren't the newest thing around. Whilst this on its own is a somewhat strange choice, there is both an in-game skill and an eternal aspect that are designed to make the unit be targeted more or less by enemies, and neither appear to work as intended, at least to my eye. I would have expected them to act in a manner such that if a unit can attack the unit with a high priority target aspect or skill, they will, and only attack the low priority one if they have no other valid targets. But I didn't notice any real difference in enemy targeting behavior with or without the aspects, even if I did keep them in use just in case my tanks or assassins respectively were getting some benefit from them. It isn't a major fatal error, but like the other complaints, it does make the game feel unpolished more than anything else. It may sound like I'm harping on Dark Deity a little here, but I only do it from a place of love. I enjoyed the game considerably, and while I was playing it for this review, I looked forward to my chance each day to play through a chapter once I was finished with my day job. The passion that the game was so clearly created with was more than a little infectious. They clearly have the potential to make something amazing and the love and drive to do it, and this was a rather grand first outing, albeit an imperfect one. My discovery that a sequel was in the works is what prompted me to start the game over and to do this review, and I'm eagerly awaiting the release of the next chapter in the franchise, for a number of reasons. The way I found out about the sequel might give me some bias. From what I've been able to see, they're really putting their backs into it, and I hope that they can learn from some of this game's shortcomings to make something remarkable. As such, my final scores for this game are as follows. Anyway, thank you for attending, and I hope you found it useful, and until next time, class dismissed.